So, you've recently discovered the joys of running around Tyria, chasing meta events, viewing vistas. Maybe you've even tried a dungeon or some fractals. And now you're thinking, okay, I'm ready to get more Guild Wars 2, but I'm not ready to drop over $100 to buy all of the expansions and DLC in one shot. The question is then, which Guild Wars 2 expansions should you buy? Before we dive in, I just want to give a quick thanks to my subscribers here. This channel is just a way for me to pay it forward to the Guild Wars 2 community, so next time you see somebody asking this question, send them my way. And if you want more content like this, please consider leaving a like below or subscribing, as it really does help. Now, you've probably already noticed this game doesn't follow the same purchase model as most MMOs. It's kind of free to play, but really just the base game, and with no shortage of limitations. But even when you purchase content, there's no monthly subscription fee ever. It's also not like other MMOs in that as you venture into new expansion areas, you'll find that even older areas are still bustling with life. Old content never really becomes outdated, and even in the oldest maps, players are still running around, participating in events, working on collections, and helping each other take down world bosses. This means that there is no one expansion that's the de facto go-to at any given time. They all have their own merits, features, and content that adds to the player experience. So let's go over the content you'll get from each expansion so you can decide which one to start with. Actually, before we do that, let's briefly overview what you get out of the base game, just so you have a little more context while deciding. Free-to-play players can fully level to the max level of 80 and get full access to their core's profession skills and traits. You'll have access to all core maps, dungeons, and fractals, at least the lower ones. You still get access to PvP and World v World, plenty of collections to do, items to craft. There's actually quite a lot to do. You'll also get a trial of the Raptor mount at level 10. There are also a few features that open up to you only if you have a paid account, which basically means owning any expansion or having an older paid core account, like if you bought the game way back closer to when it was first released. Paid accounts will get 5 bag slots per character instead of 3, and 5 character slots instead of 2. They can send mail to any player, whereas free accounts can only send mail to mutual friends. Map chat, whisper, squad chat, and PvP will have no restrictions at all like free accounts do, and they'll have access to guild halls, full access to the trading posts, and more. The first expansion, Heart of Thorns, has been packaged and sold as a bundle with the second expansion, Path of Fire, for a good long while now. So I'll kind of talk about these as a package here. Heart of Thorns takes place in the heart of Maguma. It's the jungle expansion. I feel like I should mention here that the open world maps in Heart of Thorns are a pretty big step up in difficulty from the base game, and it can be a little jarring for new players, but it's actually not that bad. The maps themselves are massive, intricate masterpieces of game design, but they can also be a massive pain in the ass to navigate when you're first introduced to them. Heart of Thorns adds tons of masteries like gliding, jumping mushrooms, and various related upgrades to those. It also adds the Revenant class, which was not included with the base game. Owners of these expansions will have access to all 7 raid wings, the legendary Envoy armor, the legendary Ring Coalescence, as well as a bunch more legendary weapons. Path of Fire is centered around Ilona, a desert region that is absolutely beaming with life and culture, despite dealing with political turmoil and threats of all shapes and sizes. Path of Fire's masteries and unlocks are all centered around mounts. Owning these expansions or End of Dragons will give you unlimited access to the Raptor mount once you reach level 10, and once you get to level 80, you can begin upgrading mounts and unlocking Springer, Skimmer, Jackal, and Griffin. Oh, and the World v World mount Warclaw. Progressing the masteries for these mounts unlocks and improves their unique features, like allowing the Raptor to leap further, making Springer jump higher, and giving the Griffin a dive bomb ability to gain tons of speed from a high altitude. Both Heart of Thorns and Path of Fire each add their own sets of elite specializations to professions, which add new playstyles, trait lines, and weapons for your profession to use. Think of them as being somewhere between a subclass like other games have, and just like a different flavor of your profession. As an example, Heart of Thorns adds the Berserker spec to Warrior, and Path of Fire adds Spellbreaker. Berserker is all about fiery, fast-paced, adrenaline-charged attacks, while Spellbreaker relies more on countering attacks, gaining stability, and inflicting crowd control effects. They're both still warriors, just different takes on the warrior profession. If you think this might be a deciding factor for you, it's definitely worth checking out the elite specs for your main profession to see which sound the most appealing to you. I'll leave a link to the wiki for this in the description below. These expansions will also give you access to Ascended gear, which will be needed to progress through higher tier fractals. If you don't already know, fractals are 5-player instance mini dungeons, and they're a very popular and profitable game mode for endgame players. Across their 9 open world maps, these 2 expansions add an absolutely massive amount of content to the game. The third expansion is End of Dragons, and it concludes the main 10-year storyline of Guild Wars 2. Thematically, End of Dragons is kind of a melting pot of various Eastern cultures, aesthetics, and lore. EOD adds lots of small features like fishing, a personal jade bot, which is basically Weibo, and skiffs, which are like little boats that you can share with your friends. It also added 4 strike missions, some really cool meta events, including the absolutely epic and spoiler-filled Dragon's End meta, and the Siege Turtle mount. And if you don't have the other first 2 expansions already, it will give you access to the Springer, Raptor, and Glider, just without any masteries on them. End of Dragons also added a massive amount of equipment and weapon skins, some new stat prefixes for them, a fresh set of legendary weapons with a myriad of Elder Dragon-themed skins, and perhaps most importantly, the final set of elite specializations, which, if you're keeping track, means each profession has 3 total. After release, EOD was followed by a small content release that helped wrap up some of the loose ends of the storyline and set us up for the following expansion. It's basically now just part of EOD at no extra charge. The most recent expansion, Secrets of the Obscure, signals a shift in ArenaNet's release strategy. Rather than going 3 or 4 years between expansions, Soto is smaller in scale, at least upon release, and it's sold at a cheaper price as a result. The trade-off, though, is that the first release will be followed up with 3 quarterly content releases at no extra charge before the 5th expansion comes out a year later in the fall of 2024. This model also means we get a constant flow of new content, rather than just a dump of content all at once and then years of silence, and it should hopefully result in a less rigorous release schedule and work environment for the devs. Secrets of the Obscure adds an easier pathway to unlock the Skyscale mount, new masteries for both flying mounts, an open world pathway to unlock a new legendary armor set, currently 2 maps with more coming in the future, 2 strike missions and challenge modes coming in the future, and access to the new weapon master training. Prior expansions added elite specs, each of which granted a new weapon to each profession through their respective specs. Weapon master training effectively removes the spec restriction from weapons, which means your profession can now freely use weapons granted through any of its elite specs, rather than only those for the currently selected spec. This might sound a little confusing at first, but it opens up a lot of creative mixing and matching with builds. Now, we just covered the releases that are explicitly billed as expansions, but this game also has DLC, so what about that? For most of the game's life, the time in between expansions was filled with living world seasons. They were kind of like mini expansions, and if you were playing the game during release, they were given to you for free, but now they can be purchased separately. The odd duck out is Living World Season 1, which took a somewhat insane approach of literally changing the game world as it happened, which was cool, but it also meant that after it concluded, that content was never replayable going forward, and everyone else just missed out. For the game's 10th anniversary, ArenaNet reworked and re-released Living World Season 1 to be included and playable more like a traditional Living World season, and now it's available for free. The remaining Living World seasons really aren't required, but they do add a ton of value to the game. All of them add new maps, metas, items, collections, currencies, and perhaps most importantly, story. In fact, if you care about the story in this game, you pretty much do need to get all of the Living World seasons and expansions in order to fully enjoy it, because the Living World seasons serve to bridge the storylines in between the expansions together, and some of them are really substantial. In addition to the content I already mentioned, in my opinion, the most significant additions here are Living World Season 4 and Season 5, otherwise known as Icebrood Saga. Season 4 followed Path of Fire, concluding its storyline in what many consider it to be the peak of Guild Wars 2's writing. It also introduced the Roller Beetle mount, and it was originally the introduction for the Skyscale, which until Secrets of the Obscure was known for being a bit of a grind. Just a side note on the Skyscale thing, there are now 2 pathways to unlock it, and both Soto and Season 4 have their own mastery lines for it. They have a lot of overlap, but they also carry bonus effects if you unlock it via both methods. Now, Icebrood Saga was kind of ArenaNet testing the waters with this whole mini expansion thing. It was released like a traditional Living World season, but it also included its own masteries, which aren't much to write home about, some really cool meta events, and perhaps most importantly, it was the game's initial release for strike missions as a game mode, so it has 7 strikes as a result, but we really only care about 5 of them. It also introduced Dragon Response missions, which are sort of like repeatable instance but optionally multiplayer story chapters, but the rewards aren't great, and most people don't really bother with them after the story if they don't have to. So that still leaves us with the big burning question: which expansion should you buy? Well, I'll say up front, I don't think most players should get Secrets of the Obscure for their first expansion. Don't get me wrong, I have been very pleasantly surprised with just how good it is, and I can't wait for more of it to be released. But it very much feels like an expansion that builds on existing pillars of the gameplay. For example, it's the only X-Pack that didn't add any elite specs, and the system it did introduce instead is really more meant to augment existing elite specs from the other expansions. The one big exception I'll point out here is if you really want that sky scale mount, because Soto does give you a much easier pathway to unlock it than the original traditional method. Me personally, I think you get better value for money getting 5 mounts through Path of Fire, including the Griffin. But if you really want the sky scale mount and it's the highest priority for you, go for it. Come to think of it, Soto really doesn't cost much more than just buying a pretty skin for the sky scale from the gem store anyway. I think End of Dragons is pretty good bang for your buck, especially if you're really into the elite specs that it offers. In fact, I would probably say that's the biggest selling point it has, which might make it a must-have for some people, or it might make it completely irrelevant for others. It really just depends on what you want to play. I have found that I personally don't use my skiff very often, though if you enjoy the fishing minigame, you likely will. And the personal Jade bot sure is nice to have, especially the glider boost and the free revive in open world, but it's not game changing. But given the EOD does include the most basic mounts along with the glider unlocked by default, I would say it's still a good choice to make if you really like the elite specs that it offers. But to me, the crown has to go to the Heart of Thorns and Path of Fire combo. I mean, this might be the obvious conclusion given that it is literally 2 full expansions for the price of 1, but they also each came out during a time when ArenaNet was, frankly, able to invest a lot more into the game. The amount of polish and features crammed into Heart of Thorns are so significant that for a lot of players, they might as well be part of the core game at this point. And Path of Fire really just continued the momentum by just throwing mountains of features, zones, and world building at the player. And the mount system, which has basically set the standard for MMO mounts now. And this combo still gets you 2 elite specs per profession, which is huge. I think for most people, the Heart of Thorns and Path of Fire combo makes the most sense. But honestly, there really is no wrong answer here. Now that you know what each expansion brings, just pick whichever appeals to you the most. The nice thing is, if and when you buy the other expansions later, they will only serve to add more content to the game for you. It only improves your experience. And those Living World seasons, you can actually buy them from the in-game gem store, which you can fund with in-game gold. They're not the cheapest, especially for newer players, but it's doable if you really don't want to spend real money on it. Plus, they can be purchased per episode, so while it's cheaper to buy them in a bundle, some people might prefer to pick them up a la carte. One more quick note when talking about buying expansions and even Living World seasons. Your type of account determines how you purchase them. If you have a normal ArenaNet account, you need to buy the content directly from ArenaNet. If your Guild Wars 2 account was made through Steam, you'll need to buy your purchases through Steam. These purchases are not cross-compatible, so just make sure you're not buying them from the wrong source. And if you really go off the deep end and you get totally hooked on the game, well, you're probably just going to end up buying them all anyway. They often do go on sale, especially around the holidays, and there's usually other bundles and promos anyway. For example, at the time of this video, you can pick up the first 3 expansions for only $50 US. And I'm not being paid by ArenaNet to say this, but I have to point out how insanely good value it is to get a decade's worth of content for that cheap, especially considering there is still no monthly subscription fee. Even buying everything, including Secrets of the Obscure and every Living World season, the entertainment per dollar value is better than practically any other form of digital media. Either way, I hope after watching this you have a better idea of where to spend your hard-earned money. Welcome to Tyria, and thanks for watching.